Sorry about that. You heard all about my travels and travails, and I hadn't turned on the chat yet. So, but today's class we're going to be looking at kind of the end of summer. I don't know if if your building department runs this way. Typically, we get a lot of pull requests to pull permits. Usually beginning this time of year, right? People have already. It's either early, super early parts of spring, right at the end of fall, end of the winter, or now that we would start to get our pull permits because people who are going to be putting in the in are thinking about how much is a lead time I'm going to have before I can actually put the pool in service. Now, inflatables and stuff like that, which we can talk a little bit about, those are a little bit different of a situation. But again, this is that time of year where I think people start to talk about pools, and this was one of those requested topics that Hope had said it was brought up, and so we want to make sure we kind of address it. So if there are questions, if you have certain conditions or questions as we go throughout this that you want to ask, make sure you use the chat feature. Make sure you put it in the Q&A, or if you want to raise your hand and ask that verbally because it's just too much to type, feel free to raise your hand. We can do that. Um, so but today we're going to try and look at pools, spas, and their relationship with the energy code. Now we know that the intent and purpose of the energy code, whether we're looking at residential or commercial, is all about providing that flexible, uh, innovative response to energy use and conservation of the useful life of a building. And when we start thinking about that in the context of pools, the question is really how do those two mix? And that's hopefully through some of the conversation today we'll be able to have that. Now there's not a lot of slides associated with this kind of a conversation, and so it is one of those topics that's very unique, nuanced, and nichey in a way, but we'll have some, hopefully some good conversations. Now we know the current swimming pool code that is from what I've read on through the CID website. The current version is the 2012 IAPMO Uniform Swimming Pool, Spa, and Hot Tub Code. Um, and so when we think about that code and the purpose behind the adoption of the New Mexico Swimming Pool, Spa, Hot Tub Code, right? I just love the name, right? And I'm not even trying to make a name up, right? But anyhow, the purpose is really just establish that minimum expectation of how we build and construct these types of fixtures or features or building structures in our communities. And when we look at what the energy code, how that energy code relates to it, um, we see some areas. Now, when we really look deep into, and I tried to short of spending extra money to download it. Uh, for the most part, when we think about what's inside or what's part of that 2012 version, it's very foundational, right? When it comes to energy conservation, it talks about, as a general standard, we talk about the method of construction, we talk about different pipings, we talk about different components in the construction process. But when we really get to those systems, those components that really address energy consumption, we really get back to what type of pumps are we using to circulate the water? What's the demand? What's the efficiency of those pumps? And it drives us back to the energy code. When we talk about, are we using solar heating to heat the pool, or which, thinking about, if we're building it somewhere in New Mexico, we're probably more likely using a natural solar heat system, not a heat pump to heat that water, right? If it's 97, 99 degrees out today, and it was, it's been up in the hundreds here recently for a couple of weeks, you're going to get some natural heating of that pool. Now, when we get into the spas and hot tubs, that's where we're going to have, again, that conversation about how are we effectively using energy in those systems? What kind of controls do we have for the heating system? What kind of lighting are we installing in those systems? Now, the pool code, and whether we look at the Hot Tubs Pool Association or we look at the code adopted by the state, we really get into this idea that there's some lighting that is desirable, let's put it that way, as far as what we're expecting and how we use that pool. Uh, when we think about commercial operations, commercial pools, or if you read some of the information coming out of the hot tub, the pool and hot tub alliance, um, what you see is a lot of the the chlorine that accumulates in pools can really be affected and reduced by the right types of light inside that water to break down those chemicals and make them a little bit more safe. But it's a unique balance. And now that I think about that, we probably could have had Greg come and talk about some of that too. Um, so maybe if this conversation comes back up again, I'll make a note to make sure we bring the Pool and Hot Tub Alliance to talk more about some of those unintended ventilation requirements or impacts or considerations that come into the indoor pool versus the outdoor pool. But ultimately, what we're looking at again is how are we retaining, what kind of things are we doing as far as wind breaks, barriers, ventilation, insulation to retain as much heat as possible in that. And like I said, the code itself is very minimalistic in that approach, and we'll see some of those. And so it refers back to some UL listings. It refers back to the IECC or 90.1, depending on your jurisdiction and the type of program, the type of building project as to how it would have complied. But when we think about the energy code as it's adopted, we think about really there's only 5 sections that really address energy consumption within the pool system. And 3 of those are residential, 2 are commercial. We're going to kind of take a look at them, break them down a little bit, and talk through them. And I will make this upfront comment. The requirements for commercial and residential pools are pretty much the same, except that we start thinking about the permanency of a pool versus the temporary nature of it in a residential. And again, we can talk about reality. My neighbors have put up a pool twice, and it's come down both times. We got new neighbors; they're putting up a pool. It's like, how long is this going to last before this is gone, as well? So it's a different animal than we might see in a commercial pool or a hotel or something like that. But when we think about this, so we're going to take a residential look first. I think this is one of those places where we think about it less. And so I think that's why, to me, it's something you bring up first. When we think about that energy consumption of pools and spas in a residential occupancy, what we're thinking about is how do we control that 403.10 really provides only 3 subnodes, and those are, the heater, the time switch, and the cover. And when we think about those systems, what the code is telling us is if there's going to be a heater installed and associated with the pool or the hot tub or the spa, right? If we're going to be heating it, then we need to have some type of control. Now, you would think that would be obvious, but it's really a question of, not only having the control, but making sure it's accessible, making sure it's available for actual use. Because one of the things that we see in some older systems is where that heat pump control, that controller, is not necessarily always available. It's in some type of I think about the pool my son works at. Those controls are in a locked room, and so if you want to turn on, turn off, and affect all that, it's not in a readily accessible place. Now, granted, that's a little bit different in the context of what we're talking about as far as residential. But if you wanted to turn off that heater in the baby pool, you're gonna have to go through a process. It's not gonna be a quick and easy thing. But one of the things we want to make sure is we want to actually have an actual control, make sure it's accessible where it's at, and then again, that if it's going to be external to the system, that it's located within 3 feet of that heater itself, so that again, if we need to disconnect, shut off, and turn off, that we can accomplish that. Now, one of the things we want to make sure is that switch, when it's installed, doesn't change the thermostat, right? That was one of those. If many of you have gone to a water park or gone to a hot tub area of a water park, right? They've got that little dial where you go up there and you turn it on. It's on for 15 minutes and then it resets. Well, what that control is doing is not turning off the heater; it's turning down the heater, right? It's a thermostatic time switch. It is not an actual pump or heater switch. So you turn that off, it's still going to stay tempered at a certain reduced level. And what we want to make sure is that that operational switch. Now you can have those time switches. We'll talk about time switches, but we also need to have that actual turn the heater off um, capacity in that design. I've told you this, and I think in passing we talked about some of this in the past. I have a neighbor or a good coworker, not a neighbor, a coworker that I've had when I used to work for the city, and he had a beautiful, I called it permanent, although it was portable, spa and a hot tub in his backyard for he and his wife. And I would always ask Mark, when are you going to use so did you get the hot tub ready? Oh yeah, it's ready. I said, okay, did you get in? Well, no, we haven't got in yet. He would spend money, time, energy, pool supplies and chemicals and all these things to have a fully operational anytime you're ready for it, got the cover on there, and then they would never get in. I said, one year I asked, Mark, how long is it? Because Mark was, a little bit higher in the age bracket than I was. And I said, when's the last time you guys got in that hot tub? Well, it's probably been a good 3 to 5 years. But you're still heating it? Well, yeah, we keep it on a low temperature to make sure it's there. We run the pumps on to make sure they're keeping going, and all that. And so it's really one of those questions of, are we effectively using energy when we run something knowing we're not going to use it? That's a whole nother conversation. But to the extent that we can structurally integrate in, or in that design and inspection process, integrate in these types of switches and controls, that's the key. Um, and one of those things that we see, obviously, anytime we talk about any type of pilot lighting system for fuel fired appliances or lighting systems, we don't want to have a continuously burning pilot light, right? We've talked about that with lighting fixtures. It applies when we think about those gas fired heaters in a pool or hot tub. So that's really what we think about the energy associated with the heating component. Now, if we don't have a heated pool, obviously this section doesn't apply, but the next sections potentially could. And so what we're looking at is a time switch that's going to operate those heaters and pump motors, right? So that there's going to be some operational control based on a preset schedule, unless it's for some public health reason or rule that says we're not running the pump all day, 24 hours a day. Again, I live in a semi, I'm not as great as you guys. You guys have pools all the time. Maybe down south where I'm at, we have temporary pool use. And so it's interesting to me how many we had a pool for several years and how much time and energy we invested in it to run the pump, to keep everything clean and never get in the pool, right? To me, it was one of those, it's time to get rid of the pool. I spent too much time and energy maintaining it and not enough time in it because our climate is not the same. So again, I can see where this might be something that is important to think about. But again, we want to have some type of a time switch to where, unless it's running for some actual, health consideration or part of a solar wastewater heat recovery system, uh, unless it's actually performing a function, the pump shouldn't run 24/7. Um, and we understand that what we're looking for there in that scenario is some type of a time switch or capacity to reduce that pump uh, and shut that pump off so that again we can serve and can think about energy consumption at that point. I guess maybe, and I'll throw this out there. This is a Q&A just to give everyone the opportunity to exercise their digital hand. Do you generally see that a significant, let's put it that way, not a majority, a significant number of your buildings, new buildings and projects incorporate these types of water features, pools, spas, and hot tubs, or is that just a uh, anecdotal thing that Josh has to think about when I think about, beautiful New Mexico? So raise your hand if you get if you think that there's a significant number of pools in your community. So we got a few. So maybe, again, maybe it's just me, and I just think everybody should have a pool because you have beautiful weather, right? Um, but I think, like there's, when we talk about that uptick, we talk about that. I think it's one of those things where we really start to think about how are we managing it. And what I love especially, and again, I see these on plans once in a while for different jurisdictions, is we identify the future pool on the site plan, but there's no pool per se within the project. And so therefore, when do we integrate in this conversation about some of these components? And especially when you're thinking about the earth movement. I've had projects, we'll maybe look at one where it's a very uh, involved project to build their pool, and so it's multiple stages where we build the building before we build the pool, that we build, and what's the strategy behind some of that. I actually have a pool design that I had an engineer buddy of mine put together for our home that I've not yet started, because it was one of those, like, this would be, if there was a perfect pool for my house, this would be it. And again, it's a significant project. And so, to the extent that now it's probably 10 years old now, so there's going to be some modifications in that process. But again, thinking about that time switch associated with those controls and those mechanical pieces, one of the things that we talk about is the cover, right? That 403.10 gets into the cover and says that we need an outdoor cover when we have a heated pool, right? And that needs to be a vapor retardant cover. And we need to have that cover. Again, if it's a heated pool, if it's an unheated pool, then the requirement for the cover doesn't apply, right? It's going to be, and then if we're utilizing renewable energy for more than 75% of the seasonal heating requirements of that building, of that pool, being at least 3 months long in that season, then we don't have to have the pool cover because we're using renewable energy, some kind of solar or some other, maybe a geo. I mean, I don't think geothermal would make sense, but some other renewable energy to power that heater. Um, so again, the cover isn't required from a energy code perspective unless it's a heated pool. And one of the things we'll talk about is as we go through today's, some of the slides today, is what is the expectation about that cover. But from a energy perspective, it's just the presence of the cover. And when we get into portable spas, right, which are going to be different than permanent spas, we go back to the Pool and Hot Tub Alliance's APSP 14 standard, right? This provides some information that focuses on the standby energy consumption, right? Not the active energy or heat pumping operations, but the standby, right? The what I call the Mark Luttrell effect, right? We understand if it's going to be heating, we're going to be using that device. We're going to have those controls in place. But if it's going to be a portable pool, a portable spa, let me rephrase that. And we're thinking about how much energy does it use just sitting there, Mark? The standard says there's some considerations on what is an appropriate level of efficiency for standby mode. And so what we normally see is in your standard spa, and the code actually, if you look at APSP 14, what it'll tell you is your average standard spa should be in standby mode. I'm gonna give it a little bit of a number. It's usually about 40 watts per gallon, right? When you actually, now there's a mathematical calculation where you multiply gallons times temperature and all that, but really what we roll out to is about 40 watts per gallon is the main factor of that equation. And so as long as the pool's standby energy consumption is less than 40 watts per gallon, then it fits within the energy efficiency of the standard. Now, let's take a step back and look at how that relates to, I think I've got a slide in here. Nope. So when we talk about, we'll jump back all the way back here. when we talk about the uniform spa code, the uniform pool code, the New Mexico spa, swimming pool, spa, hot tub code, right? When we talk about the pool code, we're going to call it pool code. When we talk about the pool code, this is all about the construction. There's very limited information or discussion about what the requirements are for the code when it comes to energy consumption. Well, if we look at even the most more modern version, what we're looking at is really I'll throw this up on the screen. If we were to actually look at the actual language associated with, oh, wrong direction. Zoom in. Right, when we get in the actual energy consumption section 306, now this is the 21 version. I was not able to get the 12, but even in the 21, what it's really telling us is that we need a heater, right? That's going to be equipped with with no continuously burning pilot light, so it's consistent with what we just saw in the energy code, right? We have a cover whenever the pool gets. Now this is where it gets a little different. So the code in the 12 version says that we're supposed to have an R6 thermal cover, right? That's the pool code tells us that, not the energy code. Whenever we're heating that pool to greater than 90 degrees, when we're looking at it from the perspective of the 21, we see it here again. It increases at the 12. So if you think about where the code currently is and where the code could potentially go, again, it's not a huge increase in the thermal resistance associated with that pool cover when we're heating it to at least 90 degrees. If I heat it to 85, it doesn't require the same level of cover, right? The same thickness. But if I'm going to have it at that, I'm going to defer back to that, again, energy consumption side. And then we look over here at the top, then we get into time switches, right? That's all efficiency is in the pool code. And it drives us back. Same thing, public health considerations, whether it's part of a solar or water heat recovery system. So again, the guidance and the energy consumption piece of it is, again, limited. I'll call it that at best. Get back to, and so when we get to this expectation of how we treat the system, again, that's what we're thinking about, is how much energy are we using in that standby mode? Because again, we've got some requirements for the equipment as it operates, and that's what ASP 14 gets into. When we have an inflatable, right? We've seen those. We all know about those inflatable portable spas. You can buy them at Costco. You can buy them on the internet at Amazon. What it's looking for, what APSP 14 says, is in that environment, when it's a portable device, an inflatable, we're looking at 7 watts per gallon in that standby mode, right? So when my kids wanted this thing because we're gonna use it as an ice bath, and then we can turn it into a hot tub, Dad. No, you're not, right? No, we're not doing it, right? But what we're looking at is 7 watts per gallon. See if I can pull over. I'll show you APSP 14. And so again, that's where we start calculating. We'll see those calculations based on, now we're not going to get into the math of it, but right, we got the standby calculations associated with different designs, right? Whether, again, we're looking at the inflatable spa in 6.2, we're looking at an exercise spa, right? Same expectation. Depending on our temperature, we have a different level of variables, right? So we're somewhere around, again, that 40 watts per gallon when we get down to the actual number that we're seeing. Whether that's, again, above 85, heating to 85, or heating to 100. Now, in future versions, we're going to see some separation there when we're spending more energy and we're thinking about that thermal loss and what we're doing to mitigate that thermal loss. That's the reason why we put that cover on, right? When we put the cover on, we're trying to mitigate the amount of evaporation and thermal loss associated with that heated pool. Going into APSP 15, now this is when we move to section R403.12. Now remember, there was 10, 11, and 12. 10 was that we need those 3 pieces, that we need that just forgot the word, control, right? The access to the on off switch. We need the time switch associated with any pumps. And then we need the cover when we're talking about a heated pool, right? 11 got us into the portable spas. 12 gets us into the permanent spas and pools. This is again when we're talking about electrically operated permanent spas and pools. And so when we talk about those, maybe again inside the house versus outside the house, that's probably where we're going to see that permanent spa. Although I've seen permanent spas installed outside, we're going to go to APSP 15, and that's just going to have a little bit different standard. That's more again about the operational expectations than the standby side. Now, it maintains some of those standby calculations, but what we really get into is identifying pump efficiencies to make sure that we have variable speed pumps, or sometimes you can find a UL compliant single speed pump, but for the most part, they're looking for variable speed pumps. The same way we talk about variable speed, in our mechanical design. So we're referring back to a lot of the mechanical expectations. Again, those minimum thermal efficiency and heat loss calculations for those pumps. How effective is it going to be? Uh, Again, the same mandates on time switches, controls. It talks about, again, it encourages LED lighting in the context of lighting provisions, but it doesn't say we have to use LEDs. It allows us to use high efficacy lighting in those systems. So if somebody wanted a different lighting system, they could utilize it. And again, it does the same to promote the use of covers as a way to mitigate evaporation and heat loss. So it's a very similar standard put together by APSP pool the Pool and Hot Tub Alliance, and again we're seeing that similar. I mean, these are not large documents. You can see they're about 40 pages. The last one was 28 pages. There's not a whole lot in it. It's more reference standards than anything, or references back to UL listings and those kinds of things. But again, that's what we're looking for in that. So when we think about some of those unique, larger projects, how does this comply with all those requirements? And really what I think is important for us to really think about and draw down to, and what is it I'm looking for as a plans examiner? That's always my question. How does this actually apply to what I want to think about? Well, when you really get into those ASP 15 standards for that permanent, if I'm building a nice permanent indoor in-ground pool, I'm thinking that now the current code does not address any insulation, any expectations about the impact of thermal loss against the ground, right? The code talks about the structural stability. If you look at the pool code, right, that the Mexico pool code, it talks about it gets into calculating the structural needs of the pool, but it doesn't get into, do we insulate, do we put in some type of thermal barrier between the ground and the pool? You really don't even see that until the 24 pool code series additions and later, where we start talking about maybe installing or starting to install certain minimum expectations. If you think about it, like our heated slabs are an R5, it's not to resist, protect, or completely negate any thermal loss into the ground surrounding the pool. It's at best to again, just like we talked about with heated slabs, it's to shunt. So most I've seen is somewhere between R3, R6 in the bottom of the pool, in order to again make sure that if we're heating it, we're returning that heat into the pool. Even some of the newer codes are making us or are requiring insulation, even if it's not heated, to again prevent or to mitigate any potential heat loss into the ground. But when we really think about it, what the APSP standards are doing is really giving us again a reinforcement of our expectations for energy efficiency. And so because we don't normally associate this with a mechanical system, when we start thinking about that electric heating when we apply it, when we provide electric heating, then that R6 cover is required, right? That R12 if we're going to the 21 version of our code, but we're not using the 21. We're still sticking with the R6 in the current standards for New Mexico. But when we start thinking about when we start using gas fired pool heaters after 2013, the standard says that we have to use an 82% efficient gas fired or gas fueled or fossil fueled pool heater. Now it says gas fired, not fossil fueled. So I guess you could technically, I'm not going to get into that, right? But what we're looking for is at least an 82% efficient heat pump or pump heater, right? Set up. When we get to electric heat pump coefficients of performance, then again it sets that bar at 4 COP. So again, if we're looking at the actual equipment when it comes into the project, this is what we're going to be looking for. What level of efficiency are we going to put on that heater? What level of efficiency we're going to put on that heat pump? And it's going to be either 82%, or a COP of 4.0. Now, if we know most of the time, when we talk about mechanical equipment, that's technically more efficient than the residential mechanical system that we put in the house. But again, that recognizes that we've got a controlled environment, whereas in this we have a less controlled environment, right? Where we're losing heat because of the process of operation. And remember, we talked about this before. There is the concept of drain water or wasted heat recovery in that design. So you may have a system that uses that heat as it circulates through that pump. Again, if you remember, that pump can run if it's part of a waste heat or a drain water heat recovery system. I like to call it drain water, not waste heat, but wasted heat. And so again, if we're trying to recapture, reutilize some of that heat conduction through that system to heat and cool the building, to heat and cool the pool, then again we can run that pump to keep it going. But for the most part, again, that's going to be something that isn't part of that design. Is it again going to go back to APSP 14? As far as that, I think it's not 14. I think it's 11 when it comes to heat drain recovery. So again, that's something that we see sometimes in some houses, and maybe we see that in a pool or especially in a hot tub. I see that more in hot tub. I've actually got a project that did use it. I didn't have any of the graphics with me or the plans, but they used it because they had a pool and a spa. So they used the hot tub spa area as the recovery system to try to preheat the pool. So the pool was never going to be heated beyond 85, right? It was just going to be like a little bit more temperate area. And so they used the wasted heat from the pumps, from the hot tub and the spa to kind of pre-temper that pool water. So any questions about residential pools that we want to talk about real quick before we jump to commercial? Not seeing any. Are many of you, we'll do another hand raise. Are many of you currently, and I won't hold this against you, and there's, no, and your things are not in there. Are any of you currently using or seeing plans that incorporate these types of efficiency levels in the equipment that's being identified? Or are you traditionally, let's just leave it at that. Does anybody see any of these efficiencies components in your current pool plan review? Okay. How many of you, let's do this. How many of you, the pools that you're currently seeing are unheated? Are unheated pools? Okay. That's what I'm thinking. For the most part, it's, at least for me, again, we live in a colder climate zone 4, which I know is the top end there of parts of New Mexico. We really don't get a lot of heated pools here because it's not worth the investment based on our climate. And so that's part of it. As far as rules on springboards, Julia, I'm gonna tell you, I have absolutely no clue. That wasn't something I looked into. Um, and I think a lot of that I never saw. Let's see. I don't remember seeing that in the context of the pool code itself. Well, let's look. Clicking the wrong button. I want this button. Yeah. And so again, I think that I'm not seeing that listed as one of the considerations in the pool. Maybe it's in safety. I'll check into that, Julia, and get back with you on that, and get you some code reference sections for that. The question is, one of the questions we have here is whether or not solar heated pools are regulated. So as long as that solar heat, that power coming from solar systems, whether that's a solar thermal or solar panels powering that heating equipment, as long as that generates at least 75% of that annual seasonal requirements, then it's exempt from the requirements that we see regarding covers, right? So that's really all that it's exempt from. It still has to have a series of components that talk about, how are we using that? Uh, when are we running those pumps? Now, again, depending on how that system works. So, like if I was using a solar thermal system where I'm taking that water, running it through a solar array in order to heat up the water to return it, then I can run that pump because it's constantly getting that water. Um, and more than likely in that situation, you're still going to have some turn off or time function because you're going to do it based on when the sun's out. You don't want to run it because you're just going to lose a lot of that water temperature in the night hours. Um, but that's really, I think, when we talk about solar heated pools, we're looking at we have to remember we have two different types of solar thermal. We have solar thermal and solar power. And so depending on either one of those, again, that might affect the cover. It may affect the switches for the pumps, but again, it's still not going to affect our disconnects, our shutoffs, and all those things. Yeah, so that bubble blanket that we see a lot of times, that is not, so that's more of a tempering of the system, and it may be an effective way to do this, because again, you'll probably get because of those air gaps in that bubble. We talked about bubbles and insulation before. So when we got those bubble blankets, um, those are going to have that R6 insulation potentially because they got the trapped air. And so that bubble blanket will then qualify as the outdoor cover for a heated pool. And they can also use it to try to focus that solar energy, that solar radiation, that solar heat gain that we talk about in the windows all the time. Try to focus that and get it into the pool to heat that pool. But that's not considered heating. When we talk about heating a pool, we're talking about a pool that's again being heated through a heating piece of equipment going through a pump and changing out that water in the process. And I agree. I mean, I'll be honest. My son works. His 14 and 15-year-old first job was at the local pool where we go, and and even in our horribly cold climate, with all that we have, not that it's cold, crazy cold, but even with the temperatures that we have, it's been in the 80s, high 80s in the water of an Olympic sized pool. They're using pumps, but not heaters. And so again, at the beginning of the year, it's freezing cold. Don't get me wrong, but when it comes to the end of the cycle, or even about 2 weeks ago when we were out there, I even got in the pool. Right, I get in the pool like once or twice a year because I'm like, it's too cold for me. But again, I think, like you said, those bubble blankets, those solar resources, are good when it comes to managing heat control. And a lot of it again is it's focusing that energy in and taking advantage of solar heat gain. That's part of what we think about when we move into to commercial, right? And a lot of times we're putting, commercial pools are a little bit of a unique situation in that we're a lot of those pool systems are going to be inside, let's be honest, inside hotels or maybe a large, living facility. That maybe a high end area that we're gonna have a pool house where we actually have an indoor section of pools as well as other things like that. The requirements that the energy code has for those kind of environments, guess what? They're identical, right? They're going to require the same expectations when it comes to that heater. That we're going to have some type of ability to control it. That if it's going to be natural, if it's going to be fossil fuel fired, gas fired, it's not going to have that continuously burning pilot light. Well, it'll, so we see those same expectations. So if we get used to how we treat a commercial pool, we're going to treat a residential pool and vice versa, right? And so we're thinking, and one of the things that I think is really critical to think about is the ventilation associated with those systems. So we'll defer back to what the UMC says about ventilation, which we can talk about. Maybe I didn't pull a whole lot of slides, but again, we're thinking about those ventilation rates are different than what we see in other conditioned spaces, right? We get the same requirements when we come to talk about those time switches. Again, if that pool's not being utilized, if we're not running it, on a set schedule, then we need to make sure that it's not running continuously. Let's put it that way. And so it may run, certain, water cycles or changes per hour or changes throughout the day. But if it's not part of that mitigation of other public health concerns, then we don't need the heater running 24/7. We don't need the motors running and pumping the pool. Again, I spend a lot of time now in hotels with pools, and at 10 o'clock, there's nobody coming back down, and so there's ways to again slow down, turn off, reduce the amount of energy being used by those pumps and motors in order to make sure it maintains a good safe pool. But then again, we're not expending unnecessary amounts of energy in the process. We have by us and a friend of mine. So we have by us one of those indoor water parks, and then a friend of mine actually did is the building inspector for an indoor water park up in the Northeast. Same similar company, and again they use a lot of energy. They use a lot of site recovered energy. One of the things that most people don't recognize, they have a lot of HRV, ERV systems integrated into their designs because they're heating that pool. They're creating a lot of exhaust that's a little bit higher in temperature. And so they send that through that ventilation system in order to retemper. They put it through that same drain water recovery system on a much larger scale to preheat a lot of the water that comes back into the system. And so again, that's that kind of efficiency that when you see in large scale pool projects, you can see a lot of it you don't see when it's a small project or if it's a singular pool in a hotel or a pool at a commercial facility, like again at a pool club or something like that. And so again, if we're heating that pool, it's going to have the same retardant, the fire vapor retardant cover. It's going to have that same R6 insulated blanket or insulated cover. So that again, if we're heating it over 90, it's going to have that R6. If it's not over 90, we're still going to have a vapor retardant cover, even if it's a heated pool. So the same expectations. It requires, when we talk about portable pools and portable spas in that context, it's the same standard. APSP 14 and 15 are APSP 14 is not residential specific. 15 is. 15, when we talk about that COP, of that coefficient of performance, when we talk about the energy rating for heat pumps and for other, the 82% efficient gas fueled heater, that's coming from APSP 15. When we go to commercial, Then we're going to go back to the what we see in chapter 403, right? 403, 404, 404. And so we're going to get those pieces of equipment are going to have to meet the efficiency of those of the energy code, right? So we'll see the boilers, we'll see the heat pumps, we'll see those kind of things. The way we see those tables, and the reason we see it that way is because again, in commercial we have those tables. In residential, we don't have the table. We have this meet the requirements of the standard or the federal minimums for mechanical equipment. And so that's where those standards really come into play is in that residential side. But again, when we have portable spas, because they're not permanent equipment, um, that's why they go back to the portable spa APSP 14. We see these, I see these once in a while identified, um, especially in some of the uh, resort town facilities, maybe either academic or I've seen some identified in fitness centers for schools or hospitals. I've seen them identified in higher end resort villas associated with maybe hotels and that kind of thing, where a client can. So I see them identified. Let me put it this way: I see it identified as potential dead load on a overhang or some type of a structural component, right? To where if we had a client, and again, it's different, maybe a different environment in the resort towns, where if we had a client that says, I want a spa upstairs, or I want a portable hot tub, or something of that nature, then again, they can bring it up and install it. And again, not worry about that loading issue. But again, that system still has to have that. What is that efficiency of the equipment when we're talking about those standby modes? And a lot of times, this is the kind of thing that we're going to see the loading, we're not going to see the equipment. I'm going to be honest, because a lot of times these are portable. And so they're not going to be part of a plan. They're just going to be something that happens. And so that's part of that reality. When we think about that in the context of everything that we talk about, well, if you have questions, obviously make sure you ask, about exterior pools versus interior pools. But one of those things that I think is important for us to really think about is the impact the pool is going to have on our lighting power calculation. And I just want to reinforce this because we've talked about power and lighting in the past. When we've talked about that interior or exterior power consumption, right? The lighting associated with water features in swimming pools is exempted from our actual calculation. So again, we're not looking in our if we looked at the exterior or if we looked in one of our com checks, we are not going to find those pool lights. Now, if it's an interior light associated with a pool, that's different, right? But when we're talking about pool lights, we're talking about the pool, the lighting inside and directly associated with that pool deck, right? So again, if we've got lighting in the pool, it is not going to be calculated into our overall exterior or interior power consumption. So again, just think about it in that context. One thing I think is important is, again, here's an example of what you might see in once in a while identified in a commercial, or again, if you got a crazy residential project, and crazy in a good way, right? Where you've got that right here, we see a manual pool cover, but you can get an automatic pool cover. I see this sometimes depending on designers or sizes of projects where they're going to have that pool cover. I'm going to talk about how it works and make sure that we think about it. And so once in a while we'll see that identified, but it's I see it rarely. But in that, what I'm looking for is what kind of controls we're going to provide in order to make sure that when it's not being utilized, whether that's because of a schedule or because of an occupancy component, or again, a default sensor that says it's off. I get a few projects which come from some again resort type communities where they've got the Airbnb style design where we're going to have a pool cover that's going to operate that's not only going to be time derived or potentially time censored, but also occupancy censored. So that again, if we don't have somebody in that unit using that building, or if we don't have that space isn't occupied by a resident, then it stays closed to maintain the temperature, to maintain that, again, that heat loss, or protect against heat loss. And so again, you may have that design that goes that extra step. I'll just put it that way. I'm always interested in when things come up for the first time in a jurisdiction. It's like, wow, we never saw that before. And again, this kind of a expectation is something that again, I see in those once in a blue moon designs. I'll call them that. And so you'll get an automatic pool cover that comes in. It's going to have some type of sensor. And again, this is where I would have probably approved this as an alternative means of method according to the code, right? It's we're going to have this automatic control that's going to operate, and then we're going to have some other concerns about, again, electricity in that environment. Show you real quick, just a quick example, a reminder of where we might see these in projects. Here's a hotel, and there's that pool with the yoga studio. And again, we're talking about the size and the uh, classification of that pool. We've got the pool, the outdoor hot tubs, plural, right, in this design. And so as I'm looking at this from the commercial perspective, remember, commercial doesn't follow APSP 15, so I don't have that efficiency. What I have is in my fan schedule down here, where we got it, just solid there, pool, right? So I've got my pool equipment room, and I've got my pool room, and I'm looking at the efficiency and the capacity, right, of those fans as they exhaust that air. And again, the pool equipment room is over here. Then they got the chemical storage associated with the pool. But we're not going to talk about that. That's a whole other conversation. One of the things that we think about a lot of times, and again, I just pulled this one out of an old file. Again, when we talk about these pools, we talk a lot about them from a zoning, maybe from a safety perspective. We talk about the depths of maybe conduit buried and connections and access. But again, a lot of times we have that. We've done this for years. We understand that we're going to have that disconnect within that 3 feet. So again, we can turn it off. We don't want it. Normally, again, it's going to be water resistive, so it's not going to be a big problem. But again, that's the kind of things we're thinking about. We want to make sure that we can turn it off and not have to run. And part of the reason why we wanted that distance is, to be honest, is we don't want to have to go all the way out here and then remember to turn it off, right? I think this provision of the code was written specifically for me because I can't remember what I did about 15 steps later, right? I lost my keys the other day, and apparently it took me a day and a half to find them. I'm like, I know I drove. After that, I don't know where the keys went. And turns out they were in a cup holder in the back seat somehow. Okay, could be. I don't know. So again, this is code change made just for me, so that I would remember as I walk by, getting out of the pool, turn it off. We're done. But a lot of times the pools that we're going to see are just going to be your simple, either insert or some very basic design, and it's not going to be like we've talked about. It's going to be mostly unheated. And so in this environment, we're looking at a fiberglass pool. We're not looking for what's your heating pump, what's your heating equipment. We're looking at what is the pump that you're going to use to circulate this air, and how is that going to, what rating are we expecting out of it? Remember, it's at 82% efficient. This is another example. I just like to remind us of just, sometimes I know we have some designers online. I love designers. I hate when designers draw, right? I'm just going to say it. They're hard to scan, as you can tell by this design. And so again, we've got this simple project where we're going to install a pool in a pool house at the back of this lot. We come in, we get a nice little design of the pool. Zoom in a little bit, right? At the deck, nice little walkway. We've got a beautiful pool by somebody else, so which is always great because then I have none of the details, but all of the questions, right? So it's going to be a question of, okay, so where are we going to, and we've got a pool house, as we can kind of see here, next to the existing storage barn. And so the question starts, all the questions start, where are we going to have that? where's all the equipment going to go? How are we going to access it? Where's those components, right? So they're going to do all this landscaping before, and not recognize where those pool elements go. And again, this is that pool house they're talking about, right? And so they're adding on to an existing storage barn, and it's like, well, what are we doing beyond just adding a couple 2x4s? I mean, where's my pump room? Is there a pump room? Is this a below grade pump system? Well, there's so many questions that come up, and I find it, again, I don't blame anybody, but one of the conversations that I always have is, where is all of this coming from, right? Where, and I get a lot of times where I'll get the pool company will show up and they'll think, well, it was all covered by the first permit. No, we got to talk, right? And that's a great, and I think you bring up a good point there, Carl, because you can kind of see we've got some pool, and I love that if you can't read it real well, but in that little box over here on the left hand side where it says potential pool by others. Well, wait a minute, it says potential, but this says pool. So is this a potential pool or not a pool? Where are my water lines, my drain lines, my water supply lines, my electric lines? Again, where is the pump going to be located in this design? Looks pretty, it's not functional. So this was one that took us a lot of time. Contractor and the homeowner were not happy with me with all the questions that we asked, but that's my job, is to ask questions. Actually, this project ended up going to court because after it was approved, the contractor made modifications that the owner didn't approve of, and so then he sued him. In long story short, digression, I will go into another day. Any questions about pools? Like I said, I'll look into that one that we had about the springboard and maybe get you some common references for that. Send that out with the CEUs when we send those out. And I'll made a note for it. If I don't see any questions, I know next week we're going to get into the inspections associated with mechanical systems. Talk a little bit more about what we look for when we do the mechanical inspection as part of that inspection series. Then we'll get back to the skylights and other fenestrations, thinking about both them as structures and how they as components, as well as how they affect other systems like lighting and mechanical calculations. Then we'll get in, and beginning in September, we'll start getting into those other components. Remember, first Wednesday is going to be plan review, or first Thursday is plan review, third Thursday is inspections, and then we'll have those other commissioning and installation conversations in those off weeks. Remember, I don't have a slide for it. Remember, if you're interested in participating in that September the 10th in-person training in Hobbs, make sure you reach out to Hope, or if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me during one of the meetings, and I'll remember to put a slide in there. I'm going to make a sticky note for myself right now. Hobbs slide. One last time before I let you all go, I'm going to throw in the chat the handout. And then if you have any questions, make sure you use the survey. If you've already provided me your AIA through your registration, you don't need to put it in the survey, but you feel free to if you want to. I still double check to make sure I've got them all and put it into the system properly. If you have any questions about technical resources, documents that we put together, please let us know. I think Hope is going to review those at this September meeting. But if you have questions along the way, always feel free to reach out to us individually, or you can email us collectively at nmhelpline@shumscoda.com, so we can help you provide any information, resources that we can provide you. Again, I look forward to the next week and some more conversations about inspections. So you guys be careful, be safe, stay nice, and stay cool in the warm weather, right? Enjoy it while it's there. Play some golf. Go play in a pool somewhere, hopefully your own. Don't just jump in a random pool and then say, Josh told me to just jump in, right? Well, you could do that. I think it'd be kind of funny. But anyhow, you guys have a great week. I appreciate you, and we'll talk to you later.